Hi, everybody. Good afternoon. All right, let's get started then. I'm sure more people will join in, but I don't want to wait too long. So today's session is titled When Women Win, Workplaces Win. And we're talking about equity tactics that resonate year-round. Because March is celebrated as Women's History Month in a lot of countries around the world, everybody is doing a lot of different events focused on gender equality this month. And it's totally okay to pay special attention this month. But of course, we need to take action for gender equality throughout the year. And I will be sharing with you some allyship strategies that you can implement at different levels in your workplace. I hope this will be a useful session, and I'd love to hear from you at different points. Let's go ahead with a quick introduction about me. My name is Saranya Manoharan. My pronouns are she, her. I am an inclusion learning specialist here at Diversio EDU. I come into this workshop having led over 600 workshops on these topics over the past few years, mainly in Canada, but also some in India. I have a master's degree in the psychology of diversity and inclusion from Ireland, Portugal, and Norway. It was a joint master's degree. So I have a little bit of lived experience in Europe as well. I worked as a research assistant at the University of Lausanne in Switzerland for a couple of years. I worked on intersectionality and hiring discrimination before moving to Canada on a more permanent basis. So having lived and worked in a few different countries, I've seen gender equity approached from different angles in different countries, and I'll be sharing some of those examples as well in today's session. Because while gender equality is common to every part of this world, the experiences can be different, so it's nice to learn from that as well. A quick intro to Diversio, the company that I work for. We are a global leader in DA analytics and compliance solutions. We work with companies across the world. Currently, we're working with companies from 51 different countries, and we have an academically validated platform that offers comprehensive DEI measurement, data analytics strategy, and consulting services. We also have training programs and industry-leading certifications. So we're here to support you, create a culture where inclusion creates lasting impact. So what's on the agenda for today? We're going to begin by learning a little bit about the importance of Women's History Month. Why do we celebrate it? And we'll take a quick look at the business case for gender equity. Why does gender equity make business sense? Most of us probably understand the moral imperative already, but we can also try to understand a little bit from the business side. Then we'll look at some workplace barriers that women face, as well as some strategies to breaking these systemic barriers. And we'll end with a Q&A session. I'm going to ask you to go onto this polling website so we can interact with one another in today's session. This is an anonymous polling website that we use to gather the audience thoughts. All right. Okay, I'm seeing thumbs up from a few different people. Excellent. So when do you think the first International Women's Day was celebrated? I see that people have started responding. Yeah, here we see the answers. Right now, 1958 is the leading answer. About half of us think it's 1958. About 30% of us think it's 1911. And around 15% of us think it's 1936. Okay. So the 36% of you that chose 1911, you are indeed correct. The first International Women's Day, as it's called right now, took place on March 19th, 1911 in Austria, Denmark, Germany, and Switzerland. Over 1 million women and men attended public events to show their support for women's rights on this day. In the years that followed, many other countries began to observe and celebrate this day. Different periods of late February and early March, until March 8 kind of became the standard day. So the United Nations recognized 1975 as International Women's Year and began celebrating March 8 as the International Women's Day, and most countries use this day to commemorate Women's Day. So why do we celebrate it? We know a little bit about the history of where it started, but why do we celebrate International Women's Day? Why do we have to have a Women's History Month? Women have not had equal rights or opportunities for many, many centuries, but just for just as long, women have been fighting for their rights. So this month recognizes both the barriers that women have faced, women of the past have faced, and women of the present continue to face, as well as the progress that they've made. It's a celebration of our resilience and the milestones that we've reached so far, as well as a reminder of the work that is left to do. Here, I want to quickly note that even though women represent a very diverse group, they still have shared experiences. And while we focus on the shared experiences, it's also important to recognize the different realities faced by different women around the world. When we're thinking about differences between women, something that might come to mind is geographic differences, right? Women who live in North America face a different reality compared to women who live in Europe, compared to women who live in South Asia, for example. But there's also a lot of differences faced by women within a particular country. If you're thinking about Canada, Indigenous women are at a greater risk for gender-based violence compared to non-Indigenous women. If we look at the US, for example, we have a lot of data that Black women face a higher maternal mortality rate compared to women from other races. If we think about class, we know that women from the working class in the UK have much less access to cultural activities compared to women from the upper classes. When I talk about cultural activities, what do I mean? Things like going to the cinema or theater, eating out or drinking out, going to sports events, etc. All the things that we think of as leisure. And yeah, we can see these differences between different groups of women. And this is something we'll delve into later on. But for now, despite all these differences, women still share a lot of experiences, whether they're trans women or cis women, women with disabilities, women without disabilities, women with higher education, women without higher education. So in today's session, we're going to use the term women, but keep in mind that women are a diverse group with some shared experiences, but also differences. So we'll kick off by looking at a timeline of women's history. We'll look at some key milestones from across the world. So all the way back in 400 BC in Greece, Agnodice is typically recognized as the first female gynecologist, and she practiced gynecology despite the threat of death penalty. So women were not allowed to practice medicine, and if they were caught, there was the threat of death penalty, but she still practiced. And she was caught, but thankfully she was vindicated and allowed to continue when her patients came to her defense. Moving quite a bit forward in 1691, we have the celebrated writer and nun, Sor Juana Inés de la Cruz of Mexico. She defended women's right to education in 1691 by proclaiming that one can perfectly well philosophize while cooking supper. So she is a national icon in Mexico, and she appears on Mexican currency. In 1893, New Zealand became the first country to grant voting rights, national voting rights to women. And this effort was led by New Zealand's most celebrated suffragist, Kate Shepherd, who presented a petition to the parliament demanding women's suffrage with nearly 32,000 signatures, which was a big effort. As I mentioned earlier, 1911 marks the first International Women's Day. And since then, many countries celebrate International Women's Day. In 1951, Doria Shafik catalyzed a women's rights movement in Egypt. She, along with 1,500 other women, stormed the parliament demanding full political rights, pay equality, as well as reforms to personal status laws. That helped pave the way for women's right to vote in 1956 in Egypt. Now we're moving into more recent history. In 1981, Sandra Day O'Connor becomes the first woman to serve on the Supreme Court in its history of around 200 years. So Supreme Court had existed for 191 years before that and never had a woman be a justice on there until 1981, of course. And she continued to serve for nearly a quarter of a century until retiring in 2006. In 2015, Trudeau appointed a cabinet with 15 men and 15 women, which was the first gender-balanced cabinet in Canadian history. And his motivation was to present a cabinet that looks like Canada. In 2017, the movement started in the US. The Me Too movement began to raise awareness of sexual harassment, especially in the workplace. But of course, that movement then spread worldwide. The phrase Me Too was initially used in this context on social media by activist Tarana Burke. But in 2017, it began to be used on Twitter on Twitter and other social media to draw attention to the magnitude of the problem. It's the hashtag is meant to empower women that have been sexually assaulted through empathy, solidarity, as well as strength in numbers. Like I said, though it started in the US, it has gone global. It has trended in at least 85 different countries around the world and has led to big legislative changes around the world. So now that we've looked at some milestones, let's review the research on gender diversity. Of course, there's the moral imperative to treat women equally because they're human beings and they deserve to be treated equally to men. But besides the moral imperative, why else should we care about gender equity in our workplaces? What benefits does it bring in terms of business? Research shows that companies that increase the number of female executives by 10% saw an increase of 9.7% in terms of profit. So that is a big number because even a 2 to 3% increase in profit can be meaningful, especially for large companies. So this kind of return, 10%, justifies the time and efforts that we spend on gender equity efforts. It's not just the moral imperative, there's also business benefits to focusing on gender equity. There is also a significant increase in productivity. In fact, research shows that productivity per worker can increase by as much as 40% when a company eliminates discrimination against female employees. Again, big numbers that we're seeing here. And we also know from other research that greater diversity in terms of gender, of course, but also in terms of other elements, leads to better decision making, increased innovation. So we're talking about new products, new services, as well as improved products and services. And new markets also become more accessible when we have more diversity within the company. So diversity makes business sense, but we can't get there right away, right? Like we need to make some changes in how we do business before we can capitalize on these benefits. So it's important for us to recognize the barriers faced by women and remove them. So we'll now take a look at some of the barriers that women face in the workplace. I'm going to present you with some data, but also please feel free to share your thoughts in the chat box about some of your own experiences as well. We'll start off with representation, right? And I have a question here for you. So we're using the same polling website we just used. If you close the website by mistake, you can still access the QR code on the top right corner here, and you can see the address on the top left corner here. So that's pollev.com/ideasm. The link is also in the chat box. So we see that people have started to respond. So let me display the responses. So what percentage of Fortune 500 companies have a female CEO? There's two answers that are kind of neck and neck, 5% and 11%. But there's also some people that think it's 25%. The answers are the answer options are on the left, and what you're seeing on the right is the number of people that have chosen that particular option, just to clarify. So the 45% of you that chose, the 35% of you that chose 11%, you're actually correct. At the present, female 11% of CEOs of Fortune 500 companies are female. I shared this number because maybe this group is a little bit different, but the general population tends to overestimate the progress that we've made with regard to gender. Many of us think that we're a little bit farther ahead. Even if we recognize that there's a problem, we think that we're better off than we actually are. So that's why I wanted to share some of these numbers. Unfortunately, only 1 in 10 Fortune 500 company CEOs are women. And this is especially stark when you see the graphic. You can see that quite often they're going to be the only person in the room. And the higher up they go, the more alone they're likely to be. And by they, I'm talking about women, of course, women in leadership. 30% of Fortune 500 board members are women. So that number is thankfully better than the 11%, but of course, 30% is still not 50%. So we have not achieved parity. Why is this the case? Even though we most often see parity in the entry-level workforce, that does not seem to translate when we're talking about representation in upper management roles. What are the different factors contributing to this? Why aren't women advancing at the same rates as men? There's lots of different reasons for this, but in this session, I'd like to focus on two main factors. So we often hear that there's not enough women in the leadership pipeline. So who becomes a CEO or who becomes an executive, those people tend to be in the pipeline, and those people tend to be developed by the organizations before they can become the CEO. But we hear the complaint that there's not enough women in the leadership pipeline. And performance evaluations are an important pathway to being in the leadership pipeline. When we think of performance evaluations, there's two main ratings, and I want to explain how men and women are rated differently along these dimensions. So there's an index of how one has performed in the past, which we can call performance ratings, right? How well have I done in the past 6 months or in the past year? And the other rating that's also really important is how well one is expected to perform in the future. Now that's potential ratings. And we see that women receive higher performance ratings than men. So they're perceived to have performed better on average than men, but they receive 8.3% lower ratings when it comes to potential. So there is a gap in how performance is perceived versus how potential is perceived. Consequently, female employees were 14% less likely to be promoted than their male colleagues. And the data for this study comes from nearly 30,000 management track employees at a large retail chain in North America. So there's a lot of data behind this particular study. So despite receiving higher job performance ratings, women receive substantially lower potential ratings. And this difference accounts for approximately half of the gender promotion gap. So when we're talking about strategies, something you might want to pay attention specifically is kind of the subjective elements of a performance evaluation, especially something like potential. Is there bias, and can we address it? That is something that we can focus on. And we'll look at strategies in the second half of today's session in more detail. Another factor that can account for less representation of women in leadership can be sexual harassment. Roughly 4 in 10 women have experienced some form of sexual harassment during their careers, and this number, of course, is far too high. Sexual harassment can have severe consequences on someone's mental as well as physical health well into middle age, even if they experienced it in their early careers. As you can imagine, this does have an impact on somebody's productivity, so that can also be a contributing factor. But there's also other reasons. Studies show that the people experiencing the harassment are much more likely to leave the organization than the ones committing the harassment. So a target of harassment may have to quit to avoid the harasser, or they might have to leave the organization that's not protecting their well-being, right? This can have an impact on their career trajectory as well as management aspirations. In fact, a study from the US that tracked people over 23 years showed that a woman that was harassed in her late 20s faced a lot of financial insecurity in her early 30s because of the job change, right? People that change careers kind of suddenly or change jobs suddenly might have gaps in their employment, might have poor references, and this can all mean that they have to accept a lower level of pay as well as responsibility. So these are a couple of factors that I wanted to touch upon in today's session to address the leadership gap that we see. In the beginning of the session, I talked about kind of the differences that exist between women, right? So I'd like to go ahead and define this concept right now. Intersectionality explains how different aspects of a person's identity, for example, somebody's race background, somebody's wealth or class background, somebody's citizenship status, all of these combine to shape their unique experiences and challenges. Why is it important to consider multiple facets of identity when discussing gender equality? Asking you this question, I'd love to hear from you. I'm going to wait a little bit and read out some of your comments in the chat box. Why does intersectionality matter? How does intersectionality influence our experiences of gender? And why is it important to consider these factors? You can speak, of course, from your own experiences or things that you witnessed. Okay, I know that can be, a bit of a longer answer, so feel free to keep typing. Importance of nuance and complexity, absolutely, yeah. We might be, if we think of women as a monolith, we're painting them with a broad brush and we tend to over-generalize. So we're losing nuance and complexity that actually exists in reality, yeah. People that possess different dimensions of diversity often have different lived experiences and outcomes, absolutely, yeah. Even though we have some shared experiences, it doesn't mean that we have the exact same lived experiences or we face the exact same outcomes. It promotes greater inclusion, absolutely, yeah. Different voices at the table result in better results, absolutely, yeah. Thank you for sharing that. I want to always need to ask ourselves who isn't at this table, absolutely. Again, I think that's a really good question. Thank you for bringing that up, right? Like all of the comments that are kind of hinting at this. Let's say we're working to improve gender equality outcomes in our current workplace. We're doing this. And let's say there's a bunch of different women and gender diverse people at the table, and possibly also men, right? Like there's a group of people, but we want to look at ourselves and see, are we able to represent all women? The voices of all the people involved. If not, who can we include? Who is missing? Who might be affected in a different way by this policy that we're implementing? Those are all questions to ask ourselves. Help others to see beyond rigid identities. Absolutely, yeah. We might have a typical idea of a woman that might be a cis woman, that might be a white woman, that might be a woman with higher education, a woman with citizenship status, etc. But we need to also consider women with different identities and how policies may affect them and what barriers they might be facing. So to share some examples of intersectionality, missing Indigenous women are less likely to be investigated. But less police investigations happen when Indigenous women are missing compared to women from other backgrounds, compared to non-Indigenous women. Black women are more likely than white women to be overqualified for their jobs because their qualifications are valued less in our society. So these are some differences that we need to recognize and think about when we're making policies in our workplaces. Treating them as a monolith misses nuances faced by different women. So I want to share some data around this as well. So this data specifically comes from Canada, but we can see similar data in other parts of the country with other identities, right? This is just an example. So to clarify, this is for women working full-time, full-year jobs, because of course, women are more likely to be in part-time jobs, and that can, of course, increase the wage gap. But I want to clarify here that the wage gap that we're seeing here is for full-time, full-year jobs. Women earned 75 cents for every $1 earned by men. But when we break that down by racialized women, we see that racialized women earned 67 cents for every $1 earned by non-racialized men. And when we're talking about Indigenous women, they earned 65 cents for every $1 earned by non-Indigenous men. So this is why it's important to take into account intersectionality, because not everybody is affected the exact same way by gender. There is more complexity to gender. We can also look at experiences, right? When we're talking about women, of course, that includes women who belong to LGBTQ plus communities, as well as women with disabilities. Nearly half of LGBTQ plus women and women with disabilities admit to toning down their statements to avoid being perceived as unlikable or difficult. So it's not just about differences in terms of numbers. They're also being treated differently in their workplace. They might be perceived as more unlikable or more likely to be perceived as difficult. So they're changing their behavior in order to fit in, and they're toning down their statements, and that comes at a cost, right? They might be less likely to be able to advocate for themselves. For Black women, a staggering 1/3 compared to their white counterparts engage in code switching to assimilate into the dominant culture. So code switching is a term that you've probably heard of before. I'd love to hear from you. If you've engaged in code switching at some point, please feel free to share that in the comment box. I think that can be eye-opening for the other people in today's session, because some of us might not have to code switch, some of us might not be code switching in that particular way. So I think it's important for us to be aware of that. So if you've engaged in code switching, please do share that in the chat box, share your experiences in the chat box. But code switching is when you have to change your behavior and or appearance in order to make sure that you're assimilating into the dominant culture. And quite often in the workplaces, this comes across as being professional, right? So there is a perception that curly hair, or especially kinky hair, which a lot of Black people have, is seen as unprofessional somehow. So a lot of women might be straightening it just to fit into the dominant culture. That's in terms of appearance. Clothes somebody wear can also be a part of this. But then there's also speech, right? Speech patterns. A lot of Black people, including Black women, might speak African-American vernacular English in their homes with their families or friends, but in the workplace, they might have to switch to standard English because they might be taken less seriously. They might be seen as less professional if they speak with the other dialect, even though it's perfectly valid and it's perfectly understandable to everybody in the workplace. That is an example that we quite often see with language. But I think I've also heard about people talk about kind of lowering their voices because they're told that they're too loud. Black women quite often get this comment that they're too loud, that they're too aggressive, because there are stereotypes associated with the Black women identity that might not exist for other women in the same way. So they're having to code switch a lot, and that's a burden because they're twisting themselves to be something they're not, because of the workplace and the standards that we place on them. I'll give it a minute more to see if there's any comments before we move ahead. Code switching is, so code switching is not just about race. Of course, that's one area that it commonly happens, but we absolutely see it with neurodiverse individuals. Yeah, thank you for bringing that up. That's a good example. It's typically called masking, right? When neurodiverse individuals have to adapt to neurotypical standards, um, and it can place a big burden on them, and it can be very, very exhausting physically and emotionally to have to do uh, to pretend to be a particular way when they're naturally not that way. Yeah, thank you for sharing that example. And I feel like even women might have to do that in some spaces that might be more male dominated. I can imagine women in some professions where they're the minority, they're probably code switching to be able to fit into that context. So that could be women from any background. Disability and work accommodation, yeah. Yeah, so I'm assuming you're talking about women with disabilities that might be code switching in their workplaces to, yeah, to kind of fit in and to not ask for accommodation, possibly. Thank you for sharing that. I have a question here for you. We, of course, didn't touch on every kind of barrier that women face in the workplace. So I'd like to throw it open to you and ask you to share some equity barriers faced by women in the workplace. You can, of course, talk from your own personal experience, but you can also talk uh, about experiences that you've seen other women go through that you've observed. So this is an open text response, so we'll be able to read your responses. And hopefully we'll hear about some things that we may not have considered before necessarily. The glass ceiling, yeah. So that relates to kind of the leadership, the gender leadership gap that we talked about, right? So you're there in the workplace in the at the entry level, possibly at the mid manager level as well. But the higher you try to go, there is a lot of barriers. You're somehow maybe not seen as leadership material. That kind of potential might not, because it's subjective, the perceptions can be different for sure. Yes, something we didn't touch on so far is caregiver responsibilities and motherhood. Absolutely. That is also a big factor, right, in some of the gender gaps that we see. We are going to touch on that a little bit more in the strategies. But that is definitely, yeah, that's a barrier that many women continue to face. A younger woman, especially in the a childbearing age, might be seen, people might be less likely to hire the woman because because of the potential that she might go on a maternity break. That is unfortunately, that is very illegal, to be clear, but unfortunately that is something that is still seen. Lack of sponsorship and mentorship, absolutely, yeah. That is also something we're going to get into in strategies in just a bit. That is really, really important when we're talking about advancement. That is what helps us grow in our workplaces, and women tend to have less access to that. Gender stereotypes and biases, absolutely. About women's roles, women's strengths can all play a part. Menopause can also pose some challenges. Yeah, there might not be enough understanding or accommodation made for that challenge that women have to go through for a few years. Most women have to go through for a few years. Double standards, absolutely. So speaking of double standards, something that we commonly hear, and you might relate to this, is when a woman is firm and assertive, it's potentially interpreted to be aggressive. While if a man were to exhibit the same behavior, that might be seen in a more positive light. Like just assertive, he might be seen as a good leader, but it might be interpreted differently. That is a challenge that a lot of female leaders face in their workplaces about how to be uh, a firm boss while still being nurturing. Those two things are seen at odds, but are expected of female bosses, and it can put them in a double bind. It can also be something that comes up in hiring as well, where they're expected to be seen as competent, but also nice. And somehow when you're seen as nice, you're not seen as competent. When you're seen as competent, not seen to be nice. And it can be a difficult juggling act. Women not supporting other women, sometimes that can happen, definitely in some workplaces, because there might be this misconception that there's only one spot, right? If we're talking about a leadership team that has one woman, we might assume that, okay, so only one woman can be present in this group. And so there's no space. So there might be unnecessary competition that can lead to women not supporting each other. That can happen in some circumstances. Perception that women are too emotional or too soft, absolutely, which is not true, but it can lead to consequences. Maternity leave and pregnancy discrimination, accommodation for nursing, yeah, that's also a challenge, a real challenge that people face and might have to leave the workforce or take a break that might not have otherwise. Ageism absolutely can, it's something that I forgot to mention when we talked about intersectionality. Ageism can absolutely impact, it impacts men as well, of course, but it also does impact women. You're either too young, where you're not seen as qualified enough, or you're too old, and that is also a problem. It's really hard to be in the right age, and older women do face a lot of challenges in finding employment after they, if they happen to lose a job. Thanks so much for sharing these. Different expectations, being expected to take on social responsibilities or socialization, absolutely. Those are things we're going to address in the strategy section. Thanks so much for sharing all of these. This set us up well for the final section where we're talking about what can we do, right? So what does it mean to be an ally to women? You can be an ally to other women as well. And of course, if you're not a woman, how to be an ally. Allyship is not a one-time action, but an ongoing commitment to advocating for women's rights, supporting their initiatives, and challenging harmful behaviors. There's a few core characteristics of allyship that includes being empathetic, being aware of the problems, educating yourselves, communicating, right? So being an ally means not keeping quiet, speaking up when you need to speak up, taking action when you need to take action. And what we mean by selfless here is that you put the priorities of the group that you're supporting first before yourself. So it's not about what you want to do for them, but what do they need? How do they need to be supported? You want to center their needs. So we can talk about allyship practices from 3 different lenses. What can you do as individuals, right? And individual allyship is important because people with at least one ally in their workplace are twice as likely to feel like they belong in the organization. And somebody with 2 or more allies is nearly twice as likely to be satisfied with their job and workplace culture. So allies make a difference. What are some allyship actions? Challenge gender biases. We talked about a few different biases that have come up. Explore your own personal biases. Even if you're a woman, you absolutely can have internalized gender biases. So definitely examine that. Practice counteracting stereotypes and be mindful of gendered language. Use gender neutral language as much as possible. I know that it's more challenging in some languages compared to others, but make sure to use gender neutral language as much as possible. Be an active bystander. If someone tells a woman to smile more or assume that she's in a junior role, correct them, right? Actually, she's leading this project. That is something that someone can interject and make sure to restore the credibility and the authority that the person deserves. Women quite often tend to be assumed to be in a more junior position than they actually are. Reevaluate your share of labor. If women are always assigned note-taking, planning, or other office housework tasks, volunteer yourself if you're not a woman, or suggest a fair rotation, right? If we saw this in one of the barriers earlier in the polling, this is something that unfortunately continues to happen. I think a rotation policy can help make it a bit fairer. Amplify women's voices in meetings. If a woman is interrupted, step in, say, hold on, I want to make sure that, for example, Lisa finishes her thought. That is something that we can do pretty easily. First, make sure to notice it. And once you notice it, interrupt that bias in action. And if somebody gives a if somebody gives a good suggestion, but let's say everybody's passing over it and kind of ignoring it, you can bring notice to that by saying, I want to go back to the suggestion that, for example, Anna shared, and rephrase that, give credit to that person, and then make sure it gets the attention it deserves. Be aware of intersectionality. That is something that we've spoken about quite a bit in today's session. And if you witness inappropriate behavior, support the person being targeted, either directly, right? That comment was inappropriate, interject yourself in that situation if you're able to distract and kind of, be a distraction, do that. Otherwise, check in with the person privately afterward. That kind of support can go a long way when dealing with these types of situations. Of course, sometimes they're more severe and there needs to be legal action. But as a first step, you can definitely support and be an active bystander whenever possible. What can we do as teams, right? These are some practices the teams can put into place to make sure that they're being gender inclusive. Offer flexibility in work schedules because unfortunately, women are associated more with caregiving responsibilities. So in a society, broadly speaking, so they might be carrying a bigger burden in terms of caregiving responsibilities. So workplace flexibility can help narrow the gaps that some of the gaps that we've seen. So give them options of flex time, have core working hours, but they have flexibility otherwise. Offer remote work if it's possible, because those can all help improve gender representation. Develop a culture of support. We talked about this earlier. Commit to interrupting bias when you see it and back each other up. I've also heard from women that they find it easier to stand up for a colleague than for themselves. Sometimes that can be true of us. If you're like that, you stand up for someone else and someone else does it for you. In the end, you're taking action. Establish inclusive meeting norms, set norms about how much time people get to speak and how interruptions happen, how much interruptions are accepted. Rotate who facilitates conversations, because again, there are gender gaps in terms of how much men and women contribute in meetings, but also perceptions of that. There are a lot of gender gaps. So kind of bringing up, setting up rules and norms around this can help make it more equitable. Notice who's missing when it comes to networking and social events. If leadership bonding events or golf outings or whiskey tastings, suggest alternatives that aren't gendered, right? This can also be helpful for men that have caregiving responsibilities, right? Because of course, they also can't do things outside of work as easily. They might not be able to. So this is inclusive of a lot of different people, and it's something we can do. So make sure that brainstorming happens within the workplace and maybe not so much in social events outside. I want to share this quick statistic here. Relationships with management account for 86% of employee satisfaction. So while there's a lot that HR and leadership can do, teams can make a big difference, and it's important for us to implement some of these practices. Someone mentioned lack of mentorship and sponsorship earlier, right? So here we have a little bit on that. Mentorship is about providing advice, support, or coaching, right? But sponsorship is a bit different from that. Sponsorship is public in nature because a sponsor will put their name next to your performance and make their support highly visible. A mentor need not be necessarily visible. The primary role of a sponsor is to help open doors and expand opportunities. But the three options that we've seen between about strategizing, creating opportunity, connecting, those are all things that mentors and sponsors can do for us. They can share the inside scoop on advancement. They can strategize with us on helping us get ahead. They can provide us with a high visibility opportunity and make introductions to influential people, and make sure to highlight women colleague strengths with their peers. Those are all things we can do. Finally, I want to touch upon company responsibilities. Having a diverse hiring panel and structured interviews with clear metrics can reduce subjective bias that we tend to see in hiring processes. This will be especially helpful, of course, in leadership hiring, but also this also works for all kinds of diversity at all levels of hiring. We can provide training to promotion and interview evaluators to help close gender disparity gaps by making sure that they're not prone to gender stereotypes, that they're not making decisions based on gender stereotypes. We talked about promotions already, so make sure to use objective measurable tools for feedback and promotions. There is evidence that women get less actionable feedback and more feedback on their personalities, which of course is not something that we can as easily change. So making sure to give constructive feedback that people can actually work on and change can be really helpful. Unfortunately, only 6 of 323 companies participate in all of the best practices that are suggested by Lean In and McKinsey, according to the study from 2023. So there's a lot of room for improvement. Finally, I want to touch on the importance of paternity leave for gender equality, because we did talk about caregiving responsibilities and motherhood. Paternity leave promotes gender equality. Fathers taking it are more involved in caregiving. They lead to equitable sharing of household and childcare responsibilities, and that reduces the burden on working mothers, enabling them to focus on their careers. So paternity leave is a really good strategy to improve gender equality in your workplaces. When men take paternity leave, women are more likely to stay in the workforce and advance their careers. It also improves employee retention, productivity, and morale. So this is something, if you don't have in your workplace, if you're able to advocate for it, I definitely encourage you to do that. I have a final question for you here. What allyship practice can you implement in the near future? Please go ahead and share your thoughts. While you do that, I'm going to go to the Q&A section and answer some of the questions that we have. Please feel free to also add other questions you may have. So what's one workplace policy or initiative you've seen actually improve culture and retention for women? Yeah, that's a really good question. I would like to answer it. So there's a few different ones. There's data behind opt-out promotions. So opt-out promotions mean that instead of you opting in to apply for a promotion, you're opted in automatically. Everybody that's eligible is opted in automatically. And unless you opt out, you're considered. This improves the number of women that advance into that get a promotion. This improves promotion numbers. When it comes to hiring, there's this effect called two in a pool effect. So when you have a slate of candidates that say you're interviewing and only one of them is a woman, and the rest are men, the chances that a woman would be hired is very, very low, is near zero. But as soon as you add one more woman to that slate, the chances of hiring a woman increase drastically. So when you're talking about interview candidates, make sure to have some diversity and not have one person from a diversity equity background, because they're seen as the odd one out and they're much less likely to be hired, even if they're actually the most qualified person. So that's something to think about. Paternity leave, I just touched upon that. That has been absolutely shown to increase retention for women. And the thing about paternity leave is the best practice around paternity leave would be having equal amount of leave for both men and women, and kind of letting each family unit choose how much time they want to, how they want to distribute that time between them. That can be really helpful as well. Moving on, how can organizations support women returning to the workforce after career breaks due to caregiving responsibilities? Yeah, I'm going to answer that as well. So there's a few different things I've seen other organizations do. One thing is an organization offered mentorship opportunities. Women do find it a bit hard to transition. So offering mentorship with women who've gone through this, that can be helpful. Easing it slowly can also be helpful, making it a bit more gradual. The transition can help women when they return from career breaks. Um, those are a couple of things that I saw. I think training specifically to kind of help them catch up is also something that's useful for women that are returning after a career break. If other people have other strategies that you've seen used, please feel free to uh, also share that. Thanks so much for sharing the allyship practices, advocating for structured, objective, measurable interviewing practices, as well as feedback, having ERG groups focus on women, diversify interview panels, continue to sponsor women. Yeah, those are all really good suggestions. I hope you'll be able to implement them. Thanks so much for sharing that. I do have okay, the final slide, the Q&A slide, there is a QR code here. You can scan this to learn, to access a free strategy session with Diversio. You can learn more about the things we do and how we help you build a more inclusive and engaged workplace together. We had some very good questions in today's session. Appreciate your time. Thank you for joining us and come back next month.